Hello, everyone. I can't hear you. The microphone is off, but we'll be starting soon, so I'll have the possibility to say hello to everyone. I think it's almost 10:30 now. Yes. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Dear colleagues, welcome to this meeting of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance that I'm the coordinator of. My name is Momodou Jallow, as you know, and this meeting will be held by video conference on the Blue Jeans platform. And I would also like to welcome all those who are following us and following this webinar through Facebook Live on the Facebook page of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And the recording will remain available on that page in case some people want to look at it, what the webinar later on. In the past month, several webinars are organized by the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination, which I'm a part of, and we have other networks too. The Parliamentary Network of Women Free from Violence, and this alliance have been organizing several webinars like this one we have today. And the video recordings of those events have been viewed by several thousands of people, because we make them available for as many people as possible to have a look at through social media. But before we start, just a formality before we can switch to the actual webinar. Can we approve the draft agenda? And if there are no comments, or if there are comments, please ask for the floor on Blue Jeans. And if there are no comments, otherwise we can consider the agenda to be approved. Is there anyone that have any comments? Please feel free to use the Blue Jeans. And this is referring to the members of the Alliance. Okay, I don't see any comments, so we can consider the agenda as approved. Thank you. Now, let me take this opportunity to welcome all of you again, and especially our guest on this very important topic that we'll be discussing here today: the infiltration of law enforcement bodies and the military by racist and far-right extremists. And as I mentioned, this webinar is open to the public, and I really am excited to hear the engagements between the public, and our esteemed guests, to hear the questions and comments on this very important topic. So we can now start with the main item of our agenda, the hearing or webinar on the infiltration of law enforcement bodies and the military by racist and far-right extremists. This is a topical issue that was recently discussed in the European press, thanks mainly to a report of the German civilian intelligence agency and to the investigative journalism of media part in France. German media and French media has been really doing a great job in trying to report some of these tendencies that we've seen. It emerged that hundreds of cases of infiltration of far-right extremism had been detected in Germany, for example, over the last few years. And I think most of us have read this report. While in France, individual members of the police forces were using far-right symbols and mottos, which are, of course, strictly forbidden by French regulations. This is, of course, a worrisome issue that calls for adequate countermeasures, which is why we are holding this webinar. It's important that we discuss it. It's important that we identify it. It's important that we find ways and means to be able to counter this. The aim is twofold. We have two objectives for having this webinar. The first one is to raise awareness of the situation, to make sure that the people and the member states and the general public to know that this is existing, this is a problem. And And it's important that we discuss it because that's the only way we will be able to know that this is a problem. And the second thing is to identify measures to address it. If we don't know it's a problem, then we wouldn't be able to identify measures to address it. So we want to make people aware that this exists, but we also want to identify what measures we need to put in place in order to be able to address this problem. On the other hand, the issue of infiltration by the extremists should not make us forget the more general issue, because there's a bigger issue in the Council of Europe member states and in all democratic countries, in fact. Law enforcement bodies and the military are part of the state, and they need to play their role in the functioning of the democratic institutions. That's their role. They help to protect the rule of law and defend human rights for everyone. That is their role. So therefore, the scope of today's webinar could become larger than what our title indicates, because our title indicates in the military and law enforcement, and normally we talk about the police and the military. But this is bigger than that. And we also talk about racist attitudes in law enforcement. And when we talk about law enforcement, we don't only talk about the military and the police. Those are, national institutions, state institutions. But we also know that sometimes we have proxies where the role of state institutions, like the police, is outsourced to private institutions, private law enforcement institutions. And we've seen this around Europe. We've seen this where I live in Sweden. We've seen how the private law enforcement is basically taking over a lot of the work that the police is supposed to do. They are not state institutions, they're private, they're for-profit institutions, so which means that law enforcement is not often the main objective, but to make as much money, as much profit as possible is the objective. So we hope this conversation is going to be open up, and we're going to discuss all aspects of this problem as we see. So this goes beyond actual infiltration of fully fledged extremists. So the Parliamentary Assembly has carried out important work in this area, including recently on the issue of ethnic profiling by the police. On a side note, in some countries, policing activities are increasingly outsourced, as I mentioned. This is a huge problem, and we need to somehow, I'm hoping that our guests would also try to touch base on that issue. It's a risky issue, as recruitment and training procedures within these companies and in these private institutions do not meet the same standards, and yet their responsibilities are very similar to those of actual police forces. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our three panelists today, three esteemed panelists, and I'm really, really excited and happy that you've taken your time to join us today. Ms. Sara Khan, who is a lead commissioner for countering extremism in the United Kingdom. Please welcome. Really great to have you. Mr. Jean-Claude Vullierme, former French National Police Chief Superintendent. We also have Ms. Rebekah Delsol, Program Manager, Open Society Justice Initiative. I've never met Ms. Sara Khan and Mr. Jean-Claude, but I surely have worked together with Ms. Rebekah Delsol on several occasions. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for finding the time to share your knowledge and your views today. As a general rapporteur for combating racism and intolerance, it is a great honor to have you, such a caliber of guests on this very important topic. So our first speaker is Rebekah Delsol, as I mentioned, the program manager from the Open Society Justice Initiative. Ms. Delsol, the organization has worked extensively on ethnic profiling in Europe, and more broadly in structural racism in the police and law enforcement. I look forward to hear your presentation, and please, the floor is yours, Ms. Delsol.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. and I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Assembly for hosting this important webinar today. This workshop is taking place, as has been said, at a time where there is increased recognition of the issue of racism and far-right infiltration into the police. And I hope that we might use this momentum to think about how policymakers and the police, and us all in wider society, can further step up engagement to challenge this issue. Over the last decade, my team at the Open Society Justice Initiative has focused on ethnic or racial profiling by the police. We were the Fair and Effective Policing team, but recently changed our name to the Dismantling Structural Racism team, both to reflect a broader remit, but also to be more explicit in naming the nature of the problem. Our project has focused on challenging ethnic profiling through research and documentation, litigation, supporting civil society, and direct engagement with the police on developing leadership and designing and evaluating innovative ways to address racial profiling. I'm going to locate my brief comments this morning in the broader discussion around structural racism in policing, how racism is evident and experienced within the police, and how this can impact policing within our communities, and then I'll begin to look at how we may address this. The murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd this summer at the hands of US police, and the uprisings that took place in the US, but also in cities across Europe and other parts of the world, drew our attention to police racism and brutality. And as was just noted, we've seen a number of media and academic reports, particularly over the last few months, documenting hundreds of examples of racism and infiltration by the far-right extremists into the police. The Europol report cited in the German media documented an increase in far-right violence in many EU states, noting that the extremist groups were seeking to boost their combat skills by recruiting military and police members. Just last month in Germany, there was discovery of a WhatsApp group with 29 police officers who were regularly sharing neo-Nazi and racist messages and images. And there's been similar WhatsApp groups that have been discovered in the Netherlands, Belgium and the UK. A report that came out in the summer by the Brennan Center showed that US law enforcement officials have been tied to racist militant activities in more than a dozen states since 2000. And hundreds of police officers have been caught posting racist and bigoted social media content. I think it's helpful for us to ask, are these examples of officers posting racist messages in WhatsApp groups, or many of the other countless examples that we could cite, examples of individual or structural racism? These activities are usually posited as examples of individual or explicit racism or prejudice, and can be reduced to certain individuals or external infiltration, sometimes referred to as these few bad or rotten apples. And while it is undoubtedly true that there are individuals within the police, like in all institutions and all areas of our societies, who hold extreme racist beliefs, these are also examples of structural racism within police institutions that make this behaviour possible. The evidence around the WhatsApp groups that I mentioned showed that in many of the cases, these officers' racist views and activities were well known throughout their department. But it was only when they're exposed and triggered and there's a public scandal around them that any action is taken. And then even then, there is rarely disciplinary or resulting termination of deployment of those officers. When I talk of structural racism, I'm referring to a system in which police policies, institutional practices, cultural representations and other norms work in various and often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequality. Structural racism is not something that people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it is and has historically been a feature of social, economic and political systems in which we all exist. And it's this structural racism and an insular and permissive police culture and the institutional failure to act that makes policing such an attractive proposition for far-right extremism to attempt to infiltrate. But it's also important that we locate these patterns in broader social developments. We are all seeing this increase in political polarisation, of racism, of xenophobia, of othering, and the police are placed in the centre of these often societal fault lines. And in recognising this, while there is certainly a need for measures to hold accountable specific racist police officers and to identify and weed out infiltration, changes must also address the broader problems of how policing institutions and cultures perpetuate and tolerate racial policies, practices and attitudes. And the impacts of structural racism on policing are many. For many police of colour, for women, for other minority groups that are in the police service, their experiences are one of daily microaggressions, of harassment, of the limiting of their opportunities. Where we do have data, it's been clear that ethnic minority officers are much less likely to receive promotion to senior ranks or to be located in the internally prestigious or valued units in the police, such as investigation or firearms teams. And ethnic minority officers are often subject to increased scrutiny, higher rates of disciplinary investigation and sanction, and then leave the police in much larger numbers than white counterparts. The Brennan report that I mentioned documents how racism and far-right infiltration has resulted in law enforcement failing to respond to far-right domestic terror threats and to hate crimes. More pervasively, structural racism has resulted in the over-policing and under-protection of racialised communities. Racial disparities have long pervaded every step of the criminal justice processes, from police stops to searches, arrests, shootings, and other uses of force, to the charging decisions, to wrongful convictions and sentences. These systemic inequalities can also instill implicit bias in all officers, influencing their day-to-day actions while interacting with the public, only serving to reinforce and legitimise racism and fostering mistrust between communities and the police. So what can we do? Often the immediate response to evidence of racism in the police is recommendations for more anti-discrimination training for the police or for the recruitment of more minority origin officers to improve workforce diversity. And while training is necessary to introduce new legal or policy requirements and can be beneficial when combined with other measures, there is, however, little evidence that standalone training for police officers on explicit or implicit bias or racism changes officer behaviour. And there's some evidence that training may even aggravate bias. It's a key principle that we will all believe in, that police or institutions and organisations should look like the communities they serve. But there is limited evidence that increasing ethnic diversity in the police can reduce racism in the police. Indeed, in the US, where there are high proportions of police officers of colour in departments, and even in leadership positions, racism internally and externally remains a widespread problem. Most studies find that police behaviour, regardless of an officer's racial or ethnic background, is similar, and it results from shared training, on-the-job socialisation with fellow officers, and the policies and practice. And it's not surprising that, given that what we're talking about is a structural problem, changing personnel will do little if the structures, policies and procedures stay the same. So addressing structural racism must take a holistic approach, grounded in political and police will to change the problem, and societal pressure to keep a spotlight and focus on these issues. There is a need for strong national standards that both prohibit individual and structural racism. The law needs to be strongly enforced through operational guidance and targeted action plans, and there needs to be clear and decisive sanctions for racism. Essential to this is the gathering of ethnic data to allow us to monitor and address racial disparities, and having strong independent oversight bodies and complaints mechanisms. And while I can give, hopefully in the discussion, many examples of individual police departments and initiatives that are focused on addressing both internal racism and discriminatory police practice, these often lack leadership and political will. And without a systemic approach to attacking structural racism, little will change. I look forward to hearing the other presentations and hopefully picking up some of these themes later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Delsol, really for a valuable contribution. You raised very important points, and some of the recommendations that you put across. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions regarding some of the things that you mentioned when it comes to the structural racism and structural racism being a structural problem in law enforcement, and changing personnel would not create any changes if the structures are not somehow changed, and the importance of strong and effective sanctions. I think these are some of the things that a lot of people have talked about also when it comes to, for example, training, law enforcement, and so on. Does that have any impact or not? Because we've seen a lot of training going on. Sometimes even within my own country here police officers, law enforcement officers saying that there's some kind of training fatigue. So I think there will be a lot of discussion. I'm looking forward to some kind of discussion and questions and comments on the very interesting points that you raised here. But for now, let's in the interest of time, give our next speaker, Mr. Vullierme. You are a National Police Chief, Superintendent with an experience in international missions, and you contributed in the preparations of a handbook for police forces on investigations, and recently in training activities in connection with the protection of journalists. Training activities, as I mentioned, as our previous speaker mentioned, the importance of having training exercises, and that is something that I've had so many times. So it is interesting that we have our next speaker who actually conducts some of these trainings speak to us. So I'm looking forward to hear your contributions. The floor is yours.
I'd like to deliver a brand new information. This morning I saw in the media, in the French media, the result of a survey according to which 33% of the French population doesn't rely on the police. Among this population, 47% of the people aged from 18 to 30 don't rely on the police. And 48% of this age group think that they are racist. That's a brand new survey. I will not comment this. Just I wanted to deliver it to you. Second thing, before my presentation, I would like to tell you that in France we have a system, a system with two administrations performing police missions: the National Police and the Gendarmerie Nationale. The first one is civilian. The second one belongs to the military. This being said, I go to my presentation. According to a quite recent global survey, 60% of law enforcement bodies vote for a far-right party in France at regional and national elections. It is the score for the general population. General population is between 20 and 30% of these votes. It doesn't mean that these officials are members of this extremist party, whose ideological basis is made, amongst others, with intolerance, racism, cult of force. But it is, for me, a red light signal, since it concerns people officially in charge of keeping peace and order in their area of responsibility and protecting all the people living there. Recently, we have had in France several cases of violent actions conducted against persons belonging to visible minorities by police officers, revealed thanks to video or CCTV systems, nourishing the old French debate relating to racist and violent behavior of police officers. Is it enough to state that the French law enforcement members are racist, violent, or in the line of an extremist ideology? The answer will be nuanced and needs a prior analysis of the situation. Beat policing is stressful because of the daily confrontation with violence, death, human misery, injustice, and others. This is particularly true for first responders who intervene in cases about which they have few or no contextual information, and for members of public order units who have to suffer frustration during demonstrations when they are insulted or victim of violence without the possibility of answer. Many police actions concern cases where foreigners, migrants, or ethnic minorities are involved. I put these facts. There is a police culture characterized by a strong esprit de corps, which is corporate spirit, but I think that also in English we can say esprit de corps. The same found in the armed police forces, the armed forces like the French Foreign Legion, the US Marine Corps, the British Royal Marines, and some other bodies, for example, the Catholic clergy. From my own experience in international police organizations like ICPO Interpol, Police, I was in the MINUSTA in Haiti, and European Union rule of law mission, EU just like in Iraq, and I think that here I met Sara in Baghdad. I can tell that I have always found the same corporate spirit, individual police officers or formed police units from various continents and countries, Philippines, China, Argentina, Russia, Brazil, America, Canada, Nepal, Jordan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Senegal, Turkey, Egypt, and Europeans. Understood in a positive meaning, the esprit de corps provides a human group with a better discipline and a better self-confidence, or allows a sport team to be more resilient to setbacks. In a negative meaning, the esprit de corps leads people to tolerate and cover their comrades' misconducts, to trick, to serve their own interests, to take the law in their own hands. Collective phenomenon in the police, it takes its origin from a strong identity. It exists at all levels of the hierarchy, but mainly at lower ranks, those who are in a daily contact with the public, patrolmen and first responders. Feeling of being rather special, feeling of being above or holding the right to use legitimate strength, feeling of not being understood by their hierarchy, by politicians, by magistrates. They say the police arrest criminals, the judge release them, wearing the same uniform, sharing similar risk, feeling of living according to a social pace different from the rest of the society, feeling of being essential, a shield against crime and disorder, feeling of being social outcasts, misunderstood, feeling of being together versus the others, feeling of living things that the rest of the society cannot experience, sharing the same stereotypes, etc. This esprit de corps results in speaking a specific vocabulary, a kind of professional slang, a specific behavioral codes, clothes, mutual protection, even when a police officer commits an offense. One does not rat on a colleague, even though they have to draft a deceitful report. And it was the case in the recent beating of a black man in Paris by 4 police officers. They drafted a deceitful report to cover their action. Unfortunately for them, the case had been taken in video and it was revealed to the press. This particularism has often been described in novels, TV series, and movies. Besides that, the police hierarchy cannot perform properly their leadership mission because of the omnipotence of police unions, who have the ears of the media and of the ministry. Instead of having to provide explanation to the upper administration, they prefer to turn their attention elsewhere when there is such a problem and ignore it. After this short visit inside the police, coming back to the question on racism and violence in the French police, I will say that they do exist. This is an ordinary or casual racism, not necessarily originating from a political ideology, but handed down from generation to generation since the Algeria War and the massive recruitment of Pieds Noirs, Blackfeet. This is the name of, it was the nickname given to European population living in Algeria before independence and who have been expelled at the independence. So they arrived massively in France, and to give them jobs, they were massively hired in the police, in the customs, mainly in the prisons and so on. And they have been massively recruited in the lower ranks of the police during the 60s and 70s. This legacy specifically concerned Arabs at the origin, but had has slowly drifted to black people also, since they were located in the same urban areas, had the same similar way of life, and committed the same kind of offences. I believe that the problem of violence, which actually exists, the French law enforcement agencies, stems from another reason, essentially the lack of proper basic training and the sense of helplessness that comes with it when they are confronted to situations then they cannot control. What can be done to combat that? I see several tracks, namely recruitment, training, control. Recruitment, and I will be very short on that. Improve the analysis and evaluation of motivation, profile, value system of the applicants. Training, reshape the programs, stressing on the main goals of a police service, human rights, rule of law, police ethics, through the study of ECHR cases, European Court of Human Rights cases. It is also necessary to better select and train the trainers. Currently, in the police schools for constables, they are trained by sergeants who are not, in my mind, they are not qualified to do that. That's a big problem. And at least control. Create an independent disciplinary body in charge of processing all the cases where law enforcement agents are involved. And I will take the example of Denmark, which has such a body which works very well. But this latter topic would require a much longer development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jean-Claude, for your really, really valuable insight. It is very interesting to listen to you, considering the fact that you've been within the service and at a higher level, and you have an interesting insight. And some of the things that you mentioned with regards to the percentage of the French population that do not rely on police is extremely disturbing. And I'm sure, when we open up the floor, there will be questions and discussions around that. Some of the cases that you mentioned, I know in France you have Adama Traore case that we talk about, and there's been a lot of discussion around it. And there are other cases, not only in France, but in Europe, where the law enforcement agencies are involved, where the reporting has been really not based on the rule of law, and there's been racism, blatant racism and right-wing extremism involved. There is a lot of hate involved, and that conversation needs to be had. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation with you, and you have been within the system, and you know exactly what you're talking about because you have extensive experience in policing and law enforcement. So I look forward to the conversation later on. Thank you so much. But for now, please allow me also to invite Commissioner Sara Khan. Commissioner, you lead the Commission for Countering Extremism, an expert committee that advises the British government on policies to counter all forms of extremism. Now, we are aware that sometimes extremism may hide within the state institutions. That is why we're having this conversation. It can hide in police forces or the military and other state institutions. And I hope we can, based on your experience, extensive experience and your work, you can tell us more about this situation and the dangers, especially the threat to democracy this poses, and how to address this problem. Please, the Commissioner, Madam Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk on what is an extremely important issue. It's a pleasure to speak today to you all. There's no doubt that we've seen a significant rise in far-right extremism in the last few years, including in the UK. In the last decade, the threat of far-right extremism has changed beyond recognition. It is growing, it is evolving rapidly, and it's becoming more complex. And just to be clear, I will be speaking specifically about far-right extremism rather than racism more generally, because they are not the same phenomenon. We've been talking about entryism, and of course entryism is a key tactic for both actually Islamist and far-right groups. In the UK, we have seen far-right extremists manipulating their way into law enforcement bodies, often targeting the military, police, and co-opting its symbols. In the UK, for example, there's an ongoing case regarding a 21-year-old police officer who appeared in court a few months ago charged with being a member of National Action, which is a proscribed neo-Nazi group in the UK. Another example is that of a British Army veteran who had served in Afghanistan for 8 years, who was described as an outstanding soldier. But in March 2018, he was jailed for 8 years for being a member of National Action. He was a recruiter for the organisation and a key part of its strategy to expand its membership within the armed forces. And he had been trying to recruit fellow members who he called committed Nazis to National Action in preparation for a war to, and I quote, cleanse our lands. Now, these are worrying cases, but I don't believe the problem in the UK of far-right infiltration specifically is a systemic one. And I'm aware other countries like Germany and others are facing a greater challenge, as we have heard today. And we are certainly not immune to the problem of entryism, especially as we are seeing a growth in far-right extremism in my country. But if I may, I'd like us to step back and think more widely about this problem, and it's something that you touched on, Momodou. Entryism is dangerous as it is a consequence of a wider problem. Whether it is entryism in our military or our police, or within our political parties or our wider democratic institutions, we need to address the root problem. And the problem that ultimately needs to be tackled is the active spread of far-right narratives and ideology, understanding why it appeals in certain sections of our populations, and how we build our capability in countering it. And this requires developing a whole society approach to countering extremism. So, for example, how effective are we in countering popular far-right narratives, whether those are anti-minority narratives, or narratives about a so-called demographic threat which centre around so-called white genocide, or narratives about historical revisionism, most notably Holocaust denial, or narratives about the so-called collapse of society and the impending so-called race war. Do we understand why these narratives appeal among certain parts of our population and how we can counter them effectively? Do we understand the changing strategic tactics of far-right actors, how they are co-opting and weaponising our democratic language of human rights and free speech to intentionally stir up hatred against minorities, to recruit and radicalise communities, and to encourage supporters to feel aggrieved or let down by the nation state? We are seeing how far-right actors are presenting and coordinating their ideologies locally, nationally and internationally, often in very subtle ways to normalise and mainstream their propaganda. And we should be under no illusion that the far-right seek to mainstream and normalise their ideological worldview in our countries to control our democratic institutions, to recruit a significant proportion of the population to their cause in order to implement their hate-filled vision for our societies. And it's this mainstreaming of far-right ideologies and narratives which we must resist at all costs. Now, like crime, I don't believe extremism can ever be fully eradicated in a society, but the successful democratic society is the one that is able to confine extremism to the fringes of society rather than allow it to pollute the mainstream. However, we are seeing an increasing shift towards online recruitment and active dissemination of extremist content, which is infiltrating particularly mainstream online spaces. We are now seeing extremist narratives, conspiracy theories and disinformation being disseminated both online and offline at an unprecedented rate to an unprecedented number of people, including a younger cohort of children. My commission has produced research over the last year or so showing how some of that propaganda is being viewed by millions, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and that is particularly concerning. Now, I mentioned a whole society approach earlier, and by this I mean it's where we all play our part. Government, faith leaders, tech company, civil society groups, we all have a role to play, and leadership is essential. I do believe the role of education in particular is critical, and I believe teaching equality, human rights, democratic norms and freedoms should be a compulsory part of our children's education in schools, and we should not shy away from discussing extremism and the harm it causes. Education is critical. Why? Because it helps build societal resilience. It inoculates people against extremist narratives, making it harder for extremists to recruit and radicalise. In order to counter extremism, fundamentally we need both legal and non-legal interventions. And I believe it's imperative that a range of interventions are used and applied to engage and support different individuals, such as young people, who are drawn into extremism, who will require counselling or conflict mediation rather than legal interventions. Using legal tools in such situations is like using a hammer to crack a nut. We don't want to criminalise those young people who fundamentally need our support. We don't want extremism or the wrong counter-extremism tool damage their lives and their future. However, it's also important we segment different audiences. My commission is currently carrying out a legal review to understand whether Britain's laws are failing to keep up with what we call the threat of hateful extremism. And it's important that the law is robust against persistent extremist offenders, organisations, individuals who play a leading and influential role in disseminating far-right extremist narratives and are organising, propagating and recruiting. I would just like to end with this final point. This is fundamentally a battle of narratives and ideas, hearts and minds. When extremism does infiltrate the mainstream, that is a sign that there is a sickness in our society and in our democracy. And we will not be able to address this problem unless we critically and honestly ask ourselves whether we are giving our populations a better vision of our societies rather than the far-right worldview. And we have to get better at showing why a liberal democracy based on human rights, the rule of law, equality and pluralism benefits each and every one of us. And we all have a responsibility to promote and work towards such a vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for those very, very important words that you mentioned. You said this is fundamentally a battle of hearts and minds, and I do agree. But as a legislator, I think also, just like you mentioned, we need to have legal and non-legal interventions. And my part is to come with legal interventions, and I'm hoping that before the end of this conversation, we will be able to come up with some recommendations as to what legal interventions that need to be in place, but that are also in accordance to the rule of law and human rights standards. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I would just like to open the floor to my colleagues, to everyone listening, to have the possibility for any interventions or questions or comments. I would advise to keep it short. And if you want to basically focus on a particular guest, please mention the guest name so that the guest would know exactly who the question is to. So please feel free to let me know if you want to take the floor. We have a question from Ms. Castel of Spain. Please, Ms. Castel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good morning. And thank you, Mr. General Rapporteur. First of all, thank you very much and congratulations for that interesting and necessary webinar. I would like to explain you very, very briefly 3 cases of infiltration by far-right extremists of the military forces in Spain, revealed the last weeks. The first example is the letter of 73 commanders of the army sent to the Spanish king, by which they assume the speech and terminology used by Vox. Vox is the far-right extremist political party in Spain. What is alarming in that is that the king, who is the field marshal of the armed forces in Spain, is remaining silent about this identification with the far-right and extremist political party. The second example is outrageous. In a WhatsApp chat where there are radicals messages from retired Air Force members, one of them stated that execute 26 million of Spaniards is a fall short solution, and he would like to repeat the 36 coup d'etat because Franco's regime, in his view, provides progress, peace, and prosperity. What is disturbing in that is that there are active commanders of the armed force in that chat, as the chief of staff, for example. No retaliation, no sanctions, no penalty, no accountability, nothing. So the tolerance of extremist position is structural in the Spanish armed forces. And the last example, and I conclude very briefly, images of the parachute soldiers singing neo-Nazis songs about the Spanish soldiers sent in the Second World War to help the Nazi forces and doing the Nazi salute in military facilities. No retaliation again, no sanctions, no penalties, no accountability, nothing. So those three examples came up the last weeks in Spain and show how structural is the far right and extremist infiltration and how weak are the democracy values inside the armed forces, and also show, sadly, the worrying silent role of the King of Spain. Thank you very much, Mr. General Rapporteur, and thank you to all the panelists for all their contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, for that comment. This is a problem that we've seen in many countries. I'm told that there are questions that are sent to me on Blue Jeans. I'm just going to have a look, make sure that I ask the correct questions here, the right questions, or the people that are asking for questions would get the possibility to ask the question. Yes, let me ask a question to the Commissioner. I think you mentioned quite very interesting points, and to be honest, you touched base on exactly what we are hoping that you will touch base on. But my question is, do you think international cooperation against extremism should be reinforced, and do other European countries have bodies comparable to your commission? Do we need this international cooperation? Because we see that different countries are trying to tackle this differently, at national level, sometimes at local level. But do we need some kind of international cooperation that would work on this against far-right extremism? Because it is, as you mentioned, the narrative that has been mainstream, because that's the ambition. We've seen mainstream political parties, we've seen high-level legislators using the same rhetoric, thereby mainstreaming the narrative of far-right groups. And that is quite disturbing, and it is, as a person of color myself and a person who works on a daily basis against far-right ideology and racism, it is scary to see that not only neo-Nazis that you see out in the streets now, as we used to a while ago, now you have people in suits and ties in spaces of power using the same narrative and rhetoric. So do we need some form of international cooperation in order to be able to effectively fight against this and counter this narrative? Or what would you suggest is the way to go for those of us that are in spaces of power that we can make legislation? Thank you.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely spot on. We do have to have international cooperation, and I don't think we can deal with this issue unless it's in an international platform as well. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at far-right extremism, what has changed, and I kind of touched on it a little bit in my speech, is this transnational nature of it. So in the UK, there are far-right British actors who are receiving funding from other non-state European actors, for example, or from parts of the US as well. We are seeing how people in the UK are impacting on far-right activity in other countries. the issue of online extremism, and I know we haven't really touched on this in particular, but that is a huge problem where we have seen, for example, in our country, where Jewish MPs in our country have been targeted by websites based in other Western democracies. And again, the whole nature of far-right extremism, and I have to say it's also clearly with Islamist extremism as well, is that it has become transnational. And I think the only way we are going to be able to deal with this effectively is by developing those international, transnational platforms, where as countries we have to come together to deal with this problem, particularly with the online space. I think one of the most prominent examples, if I could share with you very quickly, is that of GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism, which was established, which was created by the UK government in collaboration with lots of other countries across the world. Tackle 5 years ago, obviously at that time, was the threat of the ISIS threat, and how countries came together, they worked together, and obviously GIFCT was one platform. There have been other platforms to help dismantle the threats and the systemic reality of ISIS as an organisation. We don't have anything similar for the far right. I think it's high time now that as Western democracies who care about our human rights and equality, who recognise the threat of the far right infiltrating our institutions, that we need strong political leadership, stand firm, to come out and say we recognise that we're going to have to do this. Now, at the moment, I feel I feel very slightly concerned by obviously seeing the state of what's happening in many European countries, where the boundaries are becoming increasingly blurred. Where actually we are seeing the far-right sentiments and far-right political parties holding power in some of our democratic countries. And that is very, very concerning. How can we build a coalition? But I think it has to start, even if we start off with a few countries first who care about this issue, we have to start somewhere. And I don't think we've got any time to lose on this issue, because we are already, I believe, completely behind the curve. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that if and we do need strong political leadership. Just something that Laura mentioned earlier about people being silent. Being silent is the very worst thing anyone can do. In the face of extremism, silence is the last thing we should have. Speaking out in the face of extremism is critical. And for that to happen, we have to have strong political leadership. And so I urge our political leaders across all of our countries to stand up and be firm in challenging extremism.
Amen to that. Strong political leadership. That's what we need. I totally agree. Let me move on to Mr. Jean-Claude and Ms. Rebekah Delsol. This question is to you. I'm thinking, the law enforcement agencies are part of state institutions, and their roles are to serve and protect. Now, when you have an institution whose responsibility is to serve and protect, turns out and become somehow like a mouthpiece or be infiltrated by far-right extremists. Now, that is a direct threat to democracy. It is a direct threat to democracy. When you hear Mr. Jean-Claude saying a large number of the law enforcement vote for right-wing or far-right extremist parties, you hear that a large number of the population do not rely on police. This we know, Ms. Delsol, that it is the case in so many European countries. People do not have this trust to the police, because you don't even have independent oversight commissions that will look at complaints against the police. This is a systemic problem that we see. Now, what I want to know is, when the institution whose responsibility is to protect democracy, is to protect and serve, turns out to be the institution or that is infiltrated by far-right extremists whose entire or main objective is to spread hate, is to act in a hateful manner, is to attack minority groups or vulnerable communities, how does that affect the rule of law and the democracy that we all are fighting to protect? How big should we be? How concerned should we be? And what do you suggest we need to do in order to be able to counter that? Thank you.
I think you're totally right. It is a direct threat to democracy. I think we can't put the responsibility solely on the police to weed out infiltration. This is a problem for lawmakers and government to deal directly with structural racism. The police enact the law. Okay, they have a lot of discretion to do so, but it's very important that we think about external levers of change and pressure that you can put on the police to ensure that they're dealing adequately with infiltration, far-right narratives, and the racism that we've been discussing. And that has to happen at the level of law and policy. It needs to happen at the level of having institutions that are independent from the police, that are auditable, that are scrutinisable, and that also have members of communities as part of their makeup and their investigation tools and data to be able to use all of that to see what's happening in the police, to draw light on what's happening and to act on it. I think we are lucky in the UK that we do have many of the institutions that we've mentioned. There are questions about how well they often function, but we do have independent police complaints and oversight bodies for the police, which play a very important role in raising these issues, highlighting these issues. But in many European countries, there are not these bodies, and it's certainly a first starting place to ensure that we have bodies that can raise the issue, that can have oversight and look at what's happening. Without scrutiny, these things manage to go away from the light, and they happen for a long time, and people turn a blind eye, many of the dynamics that Jean-Claude mentioned. So it's key that we're really focusing on spreading the light, making this public, and doing that publicly in a way that allows us all to contribute to it. I agree also that as well as political and external pressure, it is a societal problem. It's something that we all need to keep a focus and a pressure on. We all need to be challenging racism, and I think that's been one of the heartening things to come out of quite a rubbish year all round, has really been the increased focus on structural racism, the understanding of people's experience in society, and the condemnation from all parts of society that we haven't necessarily always had. And I feel that there's new energy and new momentum to think about how we change this, how we don't make this acceptable, how we change the narrative for much more inclusive societies. And so I'm hopeful ending this year that we're going to continue to have public pressure, recognising that this isn't how we want to live, this isn't how we want to be policed, this isn't the kind of language and talk and action that we want from democratic institutions, and coming together to put pressure on policymakers to change it.
Mr. Jean-Claude?
Microphone, please.
Mr. Jean-Claude, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah. No, excuse me. I didn't have a switch on my my micro. I said that the problem we are speaking about now is the visible part of a much larger wave which is overwhelming our Western societies, and some people call that populism, which is the acceptable, between brackets, acceptable part of far-right ideas. We see that in the USA with the Honorable Mr. Trump. We can say that in all our societies. But having said that, I will have to answer the question. For the police. First thing I heard, Momodou, you mentioned police forces. For me, it's a kind of not a mistake, but a word which should never be used. We should say police services. Service shows more to serve than force, which is a way. It's a tool when the situation cannot be solved otherwise. So we can use force, but semantic is very important. When we say police forces, we mention that they can use force. When we say police service, they serve. That it's just a detail, but it has its importance. Coming back to the police, I would say that in France, one of the biggest problems is that the police hierarchy is taken, excuse my this image, is taken in sandwich between the politicians and the technostructure and the trade unions. Trade unions have been very powerful. Why? Because in France, the police managers cannot speak to the media. The préfet who are the governors in the departments or regions have this role to speak to the media when there is public order problems, or when there are criminal problems, public prosecutors speak to the press. What do the media when they don't want to speak to the préfet or to the public prosecutor? They go to the unionists, the representatives of trade unions who have the liberty of speech, and they interview them on subjects they don't know, but it doesn't matter. They speak, and step by step they have made big connections between media, journalists, and unionists. So when there is a problem, they call the unionists. They say, okay, Mr. Antel, Mr. So, would like to speak to. Okay, no problems. They speak, and they have a strong connection. So when a unionist wants to denounce a problem, they call the media. The media, okay, they will speak of the problem, and then the ministry will ask the manager, police manager, what is going on, and so on. So instead of being bothered by these problems, the police managers prefer not to see the problems and to manage administratively only the police, and let the lower rank do what they want. And a sociological study has been made in the 80s in France. Dominique Monjardet did that, and he concluded that there was a hierarchical inversion in the police. The hierarchy only follows what the lower ranks want, and it conducts to a major dysfunction in the system. So I think that if we want to reestablish something better in the French police, we should give back the hierarchy its natural power, its natural authority, and lower the power of unions, which are making intellectual terrorism. And you maybe you don't know, but last night we had police demonstrations to protest against the fact that the free police officers who have beaten this black guy in Paris quite recently under the video system, and who drafted a deceitful report about the incident. They have been put in jail, pre-trial jail. And these police officers last night in many cities of France demonstrated against that. So they consider that these guys who have committed several crimes should not be treated like other citizens. Do you see the way of thinking?
Yes.
Okay,
thank you very much for that. We're running out of time, but I really appreciate you mentioning that. And I know in France recently there has been laws in place that a lot of the population have been demonstrating against. That is meant to protect the police, but at the same time that would somehow make it even more difficult to have oversight on the police to be able to report police or to film police when they're performing their duties in a way that is not in conformity with the law. But let me ask this last question that goes to all three of you. And please, the first one is, I cannot help to mention that I've noticed throughout all these years, when you talk about far-right extremism, we talk about the one that has to do with the Islamist, and quite often every leader talks about that, and which is quite right that we do that. We have to condemn it in every way, shape, or form. But whenever we talk about the far-right extremism, it is often referred to as an individual who has no connection to any ideology, who most possibly is mentally not stable and have psychological issues, or maybe some father or mother issues when they were young, and so on and so forth. There is always some socio-economical problems that is somehow connected to far-right extremism or extremists. It is never a societal problem, but rather an individual problem. But when we talk about all other forms of extremism, it is seen as something that is connected. It is global. It is something that is connected to some organization, and so on and so forth. Why do we make that? Why do you think we make that distinction? Why? The second thing that I wanted you to quickly mention is, I would like to hear each one of you mention 1 or 2 recommendations as to what you think we as legislators, what do you think we need to do? What needs to be in place in order to be able to counter this narrative, the far-right narrative that we're talking about, and to counter this problem that we talk about where far-right infiltrates our law enforcement agencies? And I do agree, it is police services, but we cannot also forget that the police services do have the power to use violence. And that is something that is extremely important. That is why we say force. It is de facto, they can use force, and they have that monopoly power to use that. But let me start with Rebekah, and then we can go to the Commissioner, and then we can end up with Jean-Claude. The first question, and quickly, and secondly, just 1 or 2 recommendations that you want to put across before we end this, because we're already out of time. Thank you.
Great. I think Ms. Khan's best placed to answer around extremism. I think in terms of racism within the police, it is key that we have strong, decisive, clear legislation that has strong sanctions and that they are upheld and used. And I think that's a part that you can play in determining that the law isn't just a law on books. And often there is some law in countries, often about membership of far-right groups, but that it's not strong, it's not clear, and it's not enforced. And so having a strong law, but then also having operational policies within the police that enable leadership to be able to take forward those laws and to change culture and practice. And secondly, I would say data collection. Ethnic data collection is key across all elements of society, and particularly within police institutions and around their actions, so that we can measure what people are doing, the impact it's having, and be able to introduce policies and mark the changes of those policies, because we've got the data to see how those things are working. Not just data collection of around ethnic data, but I also think it's very key that we evaluate interventions. What we see in the police is often we're spending, and often at a European level, there's a lot spent on police training and intervention and cooperation, but not clearly evaluated to see the outcomes of that training and whether it's been worth the investment. We need to be much more clear on spending our money on the right things and ensuring that the training is impactful and delivers the objectives that we've agreed. Thank you.
So, I mean, very good questions, Momodou. Just very quickly, I think it's really important that, and you raise a really valid point about the way we talk about Islamist extremism and far-right extremism. I think we have to distinguish the way the media talks about it, which is sometimes not in a very helpful way. I think that we as a commission, when I was appointed 3 years ago now, I made it clear from the start that we want to look at all forms of extremism. And I think it's really important that we understand extremism as that it's not confined to a single race, religion, or ideology. It's a human and societal ill. It has existed throughout time and throughout history, and history is the greatest testifier to that. That's why we as a commission have looked at, for example, Sikh extremism. We have looked at animal rights extremism, far-right extremism, Islamist extremism, because that's how extremism is presenting. And I think if we try and present this as it's only affecting one group of people, we've fundamentally misunderstand extremism, and we fundamentally misunderstand us as human beings. How none of us are free from being guilty of having and holding bigoted and extremist views, regardless of our race, religion, or ideological worldview. So that's really important. On the point about what interventions can we have, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we are doing a legal review. We do feel that there are gaps in the law. I think for a long time we've looked at this through the lens of terrorism, not recognising that there is extremist activity in our countries that is not crossing over into counter-terrorism legislation. And so extremists are being able to operate with impunity and are not being caught by counter-terrorism legislation because they are being caught because their activity is much more distinct. And one of the challenges we've had in the UK is, how do you talk about this type of extremist activity, which doesn't necessarily result in terrorism? And so when we published our landmark report last year, Challenging Hateful Extremism, we identified what we call and describe as hateful extremism, and how that is distinct to terrorism, how it's about people who are inciting hatred, who are justifying violence against a group of people, who use the in-group versus out-group social identity theory. And so identifying a distinct type of extremist activity. I think for too long we've looked at it through the lens of violence, and often it's not. It starts much earlier on. And so what we're saying is we need to have a legal approach to dealing with hateful extremism, but also ensuring we have a strong counter-extremism strategy to deal with hateful extremism. The British government launched the first ever counter-extremism strategy back in 2015. We're the only public body to have reviewed it, and I said a year ago that that needs a completely an urgent overhaul because it's just not fit for purpose and it's outdated. So again, we need to look at this and say a counter-extremism strategy has to tackle the beliefs and the behaviours that drive people to counter extremism. We have to make sure that we are providing support to victims of extremism. We hardly ever acknowledge victims of extremism, how they are being targeted. I mean, I have experienced, being targeted by both far right and Islamist extremists, and I've met many people across our country who are not being given that support. And again, we have to broaden our understanding of the extremist threat and the problem, able to ensure that we have the right legal and non-legal tools to deal with it.
Thank you. This is Jean-Claude.
Yes.
Any recommendations? One or two recommendations?
I don't have the mic. Okay. Thank you for the micro. Yes, two points. The first one is about hierarchy. I told you that for the time being in the police, the French police, the hierarchy is outside the game. I would say that they must be reconducted into the game. It's much easier to work on a small group of persons than to work on all the police at the same time. So start the work at the head of the administration. I remember when I was at the police academy, I never heard my trainers speak on rule of law. Never. They only spoke about public liberties under legal aspects, but never under philosophical aspects. And I think that in our police programs, we should introduce this study under the aspects of philosophical aspects. First thing. The second one is about control. In the French police, we have, and gendarmerie also, we have an internal inspection. I have belonged to this inspection, and I know how it works. It's a big washing machine, but an inside washing machine, and nothing comes out from this system. I would recommend the creation of an independent body in charge of investigating on all the cases where law enforcement agents, private, public, gendarmerie, police, customs would be involved. That's are my two recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for. I would like to thank you once again for very, very interesting discussions that we had and for your very valuable contributions. This is a very interesting topic, and for me personally, it's very close to my heart because, just quickly, because we're running out of time, I remember I used to train the police, and when I went to police academy once, and I was training them about hate crimes, I remember they had a screen, it was streamed so that I could reach many other police and other police academies within the country, and they could post questions. And on that screen, whilst it was live and I was teaching, I was having a course on hate crimes, some police officers or police students, I would say, wrote the N-word. They called me the N-word live, and they said I should go back to Africa. And this happened here in Sweden, live whilst I was teaching about hate crimes. And these are the students that are going to turn to be police officers that are going to be serving and protecting. So this is a problem that needs to be acknowledged. And the problem is, if you cannot acknowledge there is a problem, then you cannot begin to solve the problem. So please, let me thank you as our guest speakers for your very valuable insight into the worrisome issue of racist and extremist and far-right attitudes within police forces, law enforcement in general, or should I say police services, law enforcement in general, and the military, but also more broadly into structural racism, which permeates our society and does not spare law enforcement. We know this for a fact. Among other things, we discuss recruitment, we discuss training, we discuss the responsibility of higher hierarchies, we discuss, leadership, data collection, awareness of racing, and so on and so forth. Thank you for all this food for thought that will feed into the work of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination, and in the near future, the report that I'm writing, which is combating Afrophobia in Europe. I'm writing this report right now, and all the things that you raise here would play a very important role in creating a balanced and good report. And finally, I would like to thank the members of the No Hate Alliance who attended this webinar, and all those who followed the Facebook live broadcast. Really appreciate you doing that. We'll make sure that we put this recording online, so those of you that have not had the possibility, you will be able to look at it and watch the video on the Facebook page of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in the coming weeks. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your valuable input on this very interesting topic. This is just one webinar. I'm sure we will have several of this kind. We can continue this conversation, and I really appreciate your recommendations. We will definitely take them on board and discuss them further. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and thanks for joining us. Thank you.